Hi guys, welcome to this week's podcast.
Hello there.
This week we are going to be talking about Kingston Penitentiary. We actually just went there yesterday and did a tour. And we are going to be putting out that video shortly after this podcast. But we just thought we would touch briefly on a little bit of the history of Kingston Penitentiary. And also talk about a few of the infamous inhabitants of Kingston Pen over the years. So take it away.
So, a bit of a brief history on Kingston Penitentiary. So it was constructed from 1833 to 1834, and it opened on June the 1st in 1835 as the provincial penitentiary of the province of Upper Canada. It was one of the oldest prisons in continuous use in the world at the time of its closure in 2013.
Yeah, and I think it's very interesting that it closed in 2013. Like, it lasted that long. And actually, we didn't get to see it all. We don't know the internals, like complete internals of it, but it's holding up not too bad.
Yeah, the stonework is incredible. Like, it's lasted for such a long time.
Yeah, so till 2013, that's quite the achievement.
Yeah. So the institution was built on land described as Lot Number 20 in the first concession of the township of Kingston. The cells originally measured 73.7 centimeters, or 29 inches wide, by 244 centimeters, so that's 8 feet deep, and 200.7 centimeters, or 6 feet and 7 inches high.
Well, that's small.
That is pretty small. I remember seeing a picture. It was basically as wide as the bed in the room, and then there was a gap in front of the bed that was, I don't know, maybe 2-3 feet, like between. And that's just like basically the room for the door, maybe.
I mean, mind you, that's 1834, 1835. So yeah, I mean, sure, I can see that.
Yeah.
It wasn't about comfort.
No, definitely
for the
not.
convicts back then.
No,
wasn't part of it.
So the area had a 12-foot high wooden picket fence, and in 1845 towers, stock walls, and the north gatehouse were completed. And from 1859 through 1861, a dome was added connecting the 4 cell blocks. So it didn't become known as Kingston Penitentiary, or KP, until after Confederation in 1867. So in other words, Kingston Pen existed before Canada even became Canada.
Yeah.
But
yeah.
Still. So the original rules for inmates stated that inmates must not exchange a word with each other under any pretense whatsoever, and must not exchange looks, wink, laugh, nod, gesticulate to each other, with violators receiving the lash.
Yeah, so that's, when it first started out, it was about being silent and not communicating with anybody, just basically doing what you're told. And our tour guide was actually a warden at Kingston Pen. We were really, really lucky to get him. He was amazing, so full of knowledge.
Yeah.
And he had talked about that's how it started out. It was just being quiet.
Yeah, and that kind of, for those days, late 18th century, early 19th century, that was kind of how prisoners were treated. Very harsh. It was then the largest public building in Upper Canada. Kingston Penitentiary was one of the 9 prisons in the Kingston area. Prisons which had ranged from low security facilities to maximum security facilities of Kingston Penitentiary and Millhaven Institution, which was initially built to replace Kingston Pen. On August 14th, 1954, a 2-hour riot broke out in the penitentiary, and the worst in its history up to that point. It was involving 900 inmates. And during the riot, a breakout was attempted but was foiled by the guards at the gate. The trouble apparently began during a morning baseball game in the exercise yard, when a guard was attacked, followed by several inmates setting fire to various buildings in the yard, including the shops and a warehouse, causing an estimated $2 million in damages.
Yeah, and our tour guide had mentioned that would be the equivalent of $20 million in damages in these days.
That's a lot.
Yeah. And we actually saw the buildings where that happened, and it's the only buildings in the entire facility that have sort of stucco walls.
Yeah, instead of the limestone blocks.
Yeah,
that make up most of it.
And you'll see that in the tour video.
The disturbance was stopped by the guards, aided by 160 Canadian Army troops and a squad of Royal Canadian Mounted Police, or the RCMP as you might know them. The 50 ringleaders were placed in solitary confinement.
Wow. And that 50 ringleaders. Oof.
That's a lot of guys.
900 inmates, 50 ringleaders.
The next riot, on April 14th, 1971, it was a riot led by the prison barber, Billy Knight. It lasted 4 days and resulted in the death of 2 inmates and the destruction of the prison. Security was substantially increased, and prison reforms were instituted. 6 correctional officers were held hostage, but were all eventually released unharmed. The prisoners were issued formal grievances to the media, including lack of recreational time, lack of work, and concerns about their future conditions in the newly built Millhaven prison. During the riot, 2 prisoners, it was a child molester by the name of Brian Enser, and Bertrand Robert, who was a man who killed his 5 children. They were murdered by other prisoners. To put a stop to what was threatening to become a massacre, another inmate, Barry Mackenzie, made a decision to release the hostages early on the morning of 18th of April, 1971.
So I think we may even do a podcast about that riot in particular, because there was a lot more to it. There are many different sides of it as well.
I believe they have different tour guides around the tour who will give information about the buildings they're in. And if I'm not mistaken, that gentleman was actually there during the riot, I believe. Luckily, he wasn't one of the people who was in the main dome, which was where most of the chaos ensued.
Yeah.
But he was present at the time, and he knew all the details.
And seeing it where it actually happened too was, and while he was telling the story, was sort of chilling in a way, because you can picture it happening as he's talking about it.
It's a very imposing area of the prison. Like, we'll have pictures of it to show you in our next video.
Yeah, and actually that was where we learned as well, which you're not going to get from our tour video, but under the dome where the prison guards were, there was a trap door that led to an armory that was under Kingston Pen, which had everything in it they needed, weapons and gases and gas masks and whatnot. I never knew that. I just thought that was super fascinating, and it stood out to me.
The armory under there wasn't even all that they had. The main armory was by the front gate, I believe.
Front gate, I think it was the north gate.
And there was also 3 escape tunnels in that main, and again, you'll see a picture of it and what we mean, but it's right in the center of the dome. And yeah, there was 3 escape tunnels so that they had a safe route out of there should anything major happen.
Yeah, it's so fascinating. I've always been fascinated with the layout of prisons and just strategically why things are where they are. And Kingston Pen, being one of the oldest and largest in the country, and it was pretty well known all over the world. Sort of groundbreaking, and just how well the prison worked and how well it was laid out. Just super fascinating.
The penitentiary served as Corrections Canada's Ontario Region Reception Centre. And before it closed, the facility housed between 350 and 500 inmates, plus another 120 at the Regional Treatment Centre contained within the prison. And every inmate was given an individual cell. In its later years, Kingston Penitentiary became known as a dumping ground for bad guards. And after an investigation by the RCMP, 8 guards were terminated.
So that's a fact that I came across, and I mean, this is quite possible that it happened. Maybe the reason why these they had some sort of shady guards, maybe because nobody else wanted to work at Kingston Pen at that point. Not 100% there. I know the few guards that we met yesterday were quite nice.
Yeah, and they
seemed fair.
They did mention that, well, at least one of the guards, I assume there was more like him, but they like to treat the inmates with respect, treat them like human beings, and then they definitely would have had less troubles, depending on the inmates themselves, because they were, I believe it was a maximum security prison, right?
It's maximum.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's all 2 years plus for federal offenses. So worst of the worst are there.
Yeah.
Pretty much.
But there were certain people who were easier to get along with, it sounds like, and they had less troubles with.
It's the nature of prison, though, really. One of the guards who was telling us a story, he was a guard at Kingston Pen for quite a long time. He said everything changed over the years as far as the prisoners. He said the newer generations was sort of the worst that he's ever seen, most disrespectful. He had basically had his life threatened, and it was shortly before Kingston Pen closed in 2013 that he was surrounded. He was surrounded by 6 gangsters, younger gentlemen, and they had grabbed him and they were threatening to throw him over. And he said he's never really seen anything like that or experienced anything like that in his entire time there. So I just thought that was interesting.
Yeah. And he said that it was actually a lifer inmate who actually put a stop to it and saved him, basically. And he said this guy was 6'5" and 250 pounds or something like that, and he said, he was on my side.
Yeah.
And it was because he treated them with respect.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, it was just it's interesting dynamic. And he was lucky to have this big fella on his side to save him from these 6 guys.
Yeah.
Because he was going over, and he knew it.
So in 1990, Kingston Penitentiary was designated a National Historic Site of Canada. And on April 19th, 2012, the Government of Canada announced plans to close the Kingston Penitentiary, along with the Regional Treatment Centre. After 178 years of service, Kingston Penitentiary officially closed on September 30th, 2013. And the penitentiary was opened in November 2013 for public tours.
Oh, it just dawned on me.
That's it.
When we went there, it was the 10th. It was closed for 10 years exactly to that day.
That's what they said while we were there.
Oh. I was paying attention when we were there.
Okay.
So I guess we'll get into a few of the fairly well-known inmates that were in Kingston Penitentiary. We're going to start with Norman Red Ryan, who is also known as Canada's Jesse James. So keep in mind that Kingston Penitentiary not only housed men, but also women and children.
Children too, even?
Children as well.
Wow.
Yeah. Norman Ryan was a career criminal, first charged with theft at the age of 12 in 1907. By 17, he was serving his first of many stints in Kingston for shooting with intent. At the outbreak of the First World War, he enlisted rather than face decades in prison. I didn't realize that was an option.
Yeah, I guess, you're doing something for the country. Giving your life, really, but maybe that's... Yeah, if they're comfortable handling guns and stuff, though, maybe. I don't know.
Maybe. But soon he returned to his old ways. By the early 1920s, he was an enthusiastic bank robber. Along with a gang of prisoners, he escaped from the pen and went on a crime spree that ended in Minneapolis. After returning to the pen, he became a model prisoner, and with the support of the Prime Minister at the time, he was paroled in 1935. After his release, he hosted a radio show denouncing crime and advocating prison reform. In 1936, he was killed outside a liquor store in Sarnia, Ontario, after a botched armed robbery attempt.
So he still went back to it even though he was denouncing crime. Well, you know.
Yeah. I mean, hard times in the 30s, I guess.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I mean, that was around the time of the Depression, wasn't it?
There was a lot happening in the 30s. But I mean, you know, he was a criminal and just that's where, I guess that was his comfort zone. I don't know. It's robbery, so it's, you know, it's not like murder. He never killed anybody. He was a robber, so I don't know if that's something that just stays with you your whole life.
Yeah,
and back in the day, too.
Yeah, addicted to the thrill or...
And the free money.
Yeah, and the money, too. I guess that's the...
Robbing a bank was a little bit easier back then than it is now. James Donnelly Sr. So we touched on this a little bit in our Black Donnelly podcast not long ago. In 1857, James Sr. murdered neighbor Patrick Farrell at a logging bee. The court sentenced James to hang, but in the end his sentence was commuted to 7 years in Kingston Penitentiary. Once out of prison, James became entangled in some of the misdeeds of his sons. But he was also falsely accused of crimes such as the barn burning of the Ryder family. James was killed by a mob in his home in the early morning of February 4th, 1880, along with other family members. So yes, even a Donnelly was at Kingston Penitentiary.
Yeah.
And he basically got away with murdering this poor Patrick Farrell. It was only because of his wife that he was granted such leniency and actually released from the prison.
And that was over a quarrel about the land, I believe, right? We would have mentioned that.
There's a lot of that. Grace Marks. So originally she was employed as a maid. She was 16 years old when she was convicted in 1843 of murdering her boss, Thomas Kinnear, and his pregnant housekeeper, who was also his mistress. Because of her age and gender, Marks was sentenced to life behind bars, while her accomplice, stable hand James McDermott, was hanged. She was pardoned in 1873 and moved to New York State. Her life was the inspiration for Margaret Atwood's 1996 novel, Alias Grace. So she was another young one that was at Kingston Pen.
Yeah, quite a life, jeez.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a whole story itself.
Yeah.
Next is Edwin Boyd. So definitely we're going to be talking about Edwin Boyd in an upcoming podcast. By the time of his incarceration in the 1950s, Boyd was a celebrity. The leader of his own bank robbing crew, the Torontonian had achieved full hero status after several well-executed bank heists and 2 successful breakouts of the Don Jail. He spent a decade in Kingston Prison.
He's an interesting character, old Eddie Boyd, as he's known. We'll talk more about him, but...
Very interesting story.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So look forward to that.
This one's pretty obvious. I wasn't actually even going to bring it up, but I remember years ago, there were sort of videos released of him, and I have a photo or two of that, and I will put it up here for you to see it. But Bernardo, murderer, serial sex offender, was sent to Kingston Penitentiary after receiving 2 life sentences. He was locked away in a 6-by-9-foot cell and only allowed outside to exercise alone for 1 hour per day.
And they had a small area for a yard in the solitary confinement wing.
Yeah, it was literally a triangle of space. I can't say for sure if they actually let him out into sort of the bigger yard, but I don't think so, because there was a separate door off of that wing, and we actually went out in it, and I do have a few photographs of the area, but it's literally like a triangle of space.
Yeah, and 1 chair out there too, so you could sit.
Yeah,
enjoy the sun.
pretty much, for 1 hour. So he spent 19 years in Kingston Penitentiary until he was transferred to Millhaven Institution, where he would spend 10 years before his infamous move May 2023 to La Macaza Institution in Quebec. Although Bernardo was kept in the segregation unit at Kingston Penitentiary for his own safety, he was attacked and harassed. He was punched in the face by another inmate when he returned from a shower in 1996. In June 1999, 5 convicts tried to storm his segregation range, and riot squad used gas to disperse them. So
He was not well liked, even in prison.
No. His former wife and accomplice, Carla Homolka, was once held at Kingston Penitentiary's prison for women. She was later in an institution in Quebec and released in 2005, so we don't need to get into her story at all. But she was also at Kingston Pen, in the prison for women.
They had a separate small building in there at first for women, and then I don't know what year, but they eventually built another prison just across the road for the women.
Next is Russell Williams. So this is another person we're going to be doing a podcast about. He's an absolute disaster. He was also at Kingston Penitentiary. So Russell Williams, one-time commander of the Trenton Air Base, was sent to Kingston Pen after 4 days of shocking testimony in a Belleville, Ontario court. He pled guilty to a series of burglaries, SAs, and the brutal slayings of 2 women. He was convicted of 88 criminal offenses. Like Bernardo, he was held in lower H segregated range away from the rest of the prison population. And as I said, we'll be covering him in an upcoming podcast. Clifford Olson. This is one fella we may or may not cover on the podcast. I can't stand him. I can't stand what he did. Whenever it involves children, I get a little bit leery about even discussing it. Maybe, we'll see. The BC serial child killer spent 10 years in isolation in Kingston Pen before his transfer in 1992 to the Special Handling Unit of the Saskatchewan Penitentiary in Prince Albert, Saskatchewan. He once filed a legal complaint that the installation in front of his cell of plexiglass pane to shield him from other inmates amounted to cruel and unusual punishment. So he was just a real piece of work. Very full of himself. This is not the only stupid complaint that he tried to pull over. Horrible person, but he was at Kingston Penitentiary in isolation for 10 years, so we thought we'd mention him.
10 years is a long time to spend in there. Now, they did say inmates could have, like, if they had their own TV, they could have it down there. They could have entertainment for themselves, but they're just a little more strict with it. You know, like, you have to be handcuffed anytime you leave your cell.
Yeah, I mean, and I have to say something here also about Kingston Pen. I guess I was sort of under the impression that a lot of these things that were provided to the inmates were, well, I guess I was under the impression that it was provided to the inmates. But speaking with the warden, he had mentioned that they basically had to earn everything that they had in their room. And so that meant they had to work. There's plenty of opportunities for work there at the prison. And they would literally have to buy their TV or buy the whatever laptop, I guess these days. So they literally had to buy it with their own money. The majority of them, when they worked, made between $5 and maybe $7 per day. So these were things they had to save up for. So I don't know. It was sort of a misconception to me. Not to say it may not happen in other prisons where they get provided with that, but in Kingston Penitentiary, every single thing that they had in their room had to be paid for with their own money.
Yeah, and it was what, I think the lowest was $525 and the highest was $690.
Yeah.
And that's a day. Not even an hour. That's a day.
Yeah, and these inmates were also basically paying the price of what we would pay in a store for an item is what they would pay. So if they wanted a fan in their room, like a little desk fan or whatever, they were paying like the $18.99 or the $20 whatever for the fan, just like we would. So imagine it took them like basically a week's pay to buy a fan.
Yeah. Sort
of thing.
And I believe it was $1 from each pay they got. Was it each pay or every day? They were paying into like what do they call it? An inmate welfare fund, and it's not like welfare that we have in society, but it's literally for their welfare. So
yeah, a saving. It's a savings.
Yeah. That
each contributed to.
So it'd be like, if they wanted to have like a get together in the gym, or if they were having family, they could pay for. And it wasn't for anyone in particular; it's for all the inmates. So it would be
to access over time, sort of.
Yeah.
Sort of like a bank account that they could access as needed for Easter dinners or Thanksgiving dinners, or if they had conjugal family visits, they could buy something for that, buy games or food for the children, or so that was also very interesting. Yeah. So last but not least is Tyrone Conn.
This guy was smart.
He was smart. Like, he was something else. And we are absolutely 100% going to do a podcast about him very, very soon. While he was serving a sentence of 47 years for a string of armed robberies, in fact, since he was 13 years old, Ty had been only legally at large for 69 days. So all the rest of the time, he was incarcerated somewhere at some point. He was subsequently transferred to the notorious Kingston Penitentiary after acting as an informant in another facility, telling security staff of a violent escape plan hatched by fellow inmates. So, interesting that he would do that, because he himself escaped from Kingston Penitentiary, the first successful escape in 4 decades. He later died in a squat basement apartment in Toronto from an apparent self-inflicted shotgun wound to the chest. So, like I said, we're going to talk about that story of Tyconn very, very soon. Even there's a lot of debate about how he passed away in Toronto. But there is a whole story about him here. He grew up very, very rough. Horrible childhood. We'll talk about that. And we will talk about this escape because it is something else. And luck fell into his lap one day. Yeah. And that is how he got out. But we will definitely get into that. Yeah. So thank you for joining us for this brief look at the history of Kingston Pen.
Thank you, guys.
And some of its infamous inhabitants. We will definitely touch on the topic of Kingston Pen as we talk about a few of the inmates there over time. And also stay tuned for our tour of Kingston Penitentiary coming up very, very shortly. Just has to be edited. So we could not film video in there, but we could take pictures of everything. So I'm going to try to make it where you're going to get the idea of where it is, whether I have to do a voiceover or put some words on the screen. But you're definitely going to see exactly what we saw. We made a few detours in Kingston itself. Yeah. Due to the fact that it was Truth and Reconciliation Day, I wanted to make it a point to visit a couple of the sites of Sir John A. Macdonald, who was the very first Prime Minister of Canada. And I really wanted to do it on that day because he was horrible to Indigenous people. And we're going to show you a few of the sites. And actually something that was happening that was quite interesting at his home in Kingston. So stay tuned for that video.
Yeah, keep an eye out, guys. And we'll see you next time.
Okay, thanks, guys. Bye.